We're just a couple of days away from the scheduled end of COP29 in Baku, and whilst there are lots of very important issues still being negotiated, still needing to move forward to get close to agreement for the end of the COP, the one that's at the heart of this COP is climate finance. Delegates here know that they must leave with a realistic but ambitious commitment to the level of climate finance that wealthy developed nations will pay to support poorer developing nations to implement the Paris Agreement. That means to develop sustainably, to adapt to worsening climate impacts, and to pay for the damage and loss caused by those impacts. Recently, a UN Secretary General commissioned group of experts have put a number on that and shown that what is needed is $1 trillion a year for emerging markets and developing countries by 2030, and 1.3 trillion, going up to 1.3 trillion by 2035. But that doesn't mean that all of that is expected to come from from governments. It doesn't mean that it's all expected to come even from existing sources. They reckon that half of that needs to come from private sources, half of that needs to come from public sources. Within the public sources, they've broken that down to show what needs to come from governments, what needs to come from multilateral development banks, and also one of the most interesting discussions here and at the G20 around solidarity levies, new forms of raising funds globally from, for example, taxes on the ultra wealthy, or a levy on financial transactions, for example. Whilst inside the negotiating rooms there is obviously a focus on what might be considered the very dry detail of people's red lines, of how they can agree to what the overall amount should be, where it should come from, who should be able to access it. Outside, there's very much a focus on explaining the real-world impacts. There are people here from all over the world, many of them from places whose not just whose lives and livelihoods are affected by worsening climate impacts, whose very existence as nations is threatened by it. There were ministers from African nations explaining that the cost of adaptation for sub-Saharan Africa over the next 10 years is between 30 to 50 billion. That's 2 to 3% of their GDP. And of course the impacts around the world are felt everywhere. We may not experience the worst of the impacts in the UK, but we import 2/5 of our food from overseas, and as those extremes hit harvests and cause shortages, so they drive up the cost of our food at home in the UK as well.